My name is Pontus Aspenström, and I'm the National Director of EATRIS Sweden, despite the strange spelling of my name in this Zoom meeting. But I will try to change it over time. But anyway, on my side, to help me moderate this, I have Ulrika Bäckman, that's the National Coordinator for EATRIS Sweden. And what is EATRIS? I will not say so much, but it's a European infrastructure for translational medicine, and the role of EATRIS to bring together resources and services for research communities to translate scientific discoveries into benefits for patients. That's a short description. So this webinar, I'm happy to have David Morrow from EATRIS. He is platform manager for two of the key platforms run by EATRIS, the ATMP and the vaccines platforms. And David will talk about the regulatory projects that EATRIS is involved in. And I think the focus will be on Isidori and CanServe. But we are also happy to have support from RegSmart, which is a co-organizer of this webinar. And RegSmart is a regulatory consultancy firm here in Uppsala in pharma and medical devices. And the role is to help researchers navigate in the dynamic, but also rather complex and evolving regulatory landscape. So that's really a key function, and that's the aim of this webinar. And just, I will also briefly present the three representatives from RegSmart. So we have Senior Consultant Anna Wannberg, who is a PhD in toxicology, and she will talk about the art of choosing the right regulatory framework. And she will discuss what is regulatory framework and how do you find the one that suits your product. Secondly, we have Senior Consultant Robert Hägerkvist with a PhD in medical cell biology. And he will talk about how to register a new drug, present a crash course, basically. So he will talk about how to plan your development program to obtain a product for the market that can be approved by the regulatory authorities. And finally, we have Senior Consultant Karin Westermark with a PhD in physics or electrochemistry. She will talk about bringing your medical device to the market. What is needed to develop a successful medical device for the market? So with this introduction, I can say that after each presentation, you can, of course, we have time for a few questions, and you can use the raise hand function in Zoom, or you can write questions in the chat. Ulrika will help me to read the chat. So please, David.
Great. Thank you, Pontus. Thank you, Ulrika, for setting this up today. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to discuss a little bit about who EATRIS is, what it does. So it's a short presentation, so I'll give you the helicopter view of what we do. And I'd also like to mention a couple of initiatives that may be of interest to you at the moment that Pontus mentioned, called Isidori and CanServe. Just wanted to make sure you have the right view.
We have the presentation, your view, so to speak.
No, better?
That's better.
Yeah. I'll get good at this eventually at one point. Okay, so maybe just to let you know that we will share these slides with everybody afterwards because it's a short presentation. So just try and just to give you a feel of what we do. So we are what is referred to as a distributed research infrastructure. And these research infrastructures in Europe are an important asset to support research and innovation within Europe. So maybe you have this general idea or classic view of what an infrastructure is, some rather large, beautiful, shiny building or piece of equipment, such as what CERN has with their Large Hadron Collider. But distributed infrastructures are different. We are a large consortium of research facilities that are built up from bricks and expertise that already exists. So specifically EATRIS, our role is to provide facilities, resources, and services to support cutting-edge research. Presently, we are 14 countries with 127 institutions across those 14 countries. We operate across 5 platforms, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute, and our legal status is a non-profit ERIC. Our goal, our aim, is to accelerate the translation of research discoveries into patient benefit, and we do this by supporting using our capacities, expertise, example, to academia, industry, and to patients and policy makers. What we do is we provide user access to research and expert services. We help develop new research tools, provide education training, which is core to our mission, and overall just try and improve the conditions for translational research. So the 5 scientific platforms we operate across are, first of all, ATMPs, advanced therapies, and this covers tissue engineering, cell therapy, and gene therapy. We have a biomarker platform covering everything from biomarker facilities, immunostaining, deep genome sequencing, imaging and tracing, such as PET imaging, small molecules, and vaccines, inflammation, and immune monitoring. So I think you can imagine with 127 sites across these 14 countries, we pretty much are able to tick every box in the translational pipeline across each of these areas. So what do we do for academia? Well, we support and provide access to research development expertise. We help them validate their technologies, and we support their innovation. Now, this can be done several ways, and maybe one way to mention to any academics that are here today, perhaps if you're in the pursuit of funding, you may want to try and build up your consortium by adding an expert, for example, in animal models, or an expert in regulatory, which we'll talk a bit about more in a minute. EATRIS plays a central role there to help you build that consortium so you can go after the funding you need to get your technology further down that pipeline. Industry, it's kind of similar. We're offering industry access to the academic expertise that resides within that 127 sites, helping them validate their tools and improve the development program. But I suppose facilitate the public-private collaboration, because I think most of you will know that it's not so easy sometimes for industry to work with academia. Academia speaks a different language in many cases. So EATRIS plays a great role in being a bridge to help facilitate and take the pain out of such collaborations. How we do that? Well, industry will come to us with a request. For example, we need access to patient samples. We need access to an animal model or some type of assay. We do this and support them by exploring our network, identifying partners for them, such as 5 groups that could potentially offer what they're needing, and then they choose and make a choice. And if they want to work with that group, we then facilitate that collaboration. So different types of partnering examples we do on a daily basis. It could be a simple request, such as one from Bialica a few years ago, looking for expertise for fragment-based discovery. We were able to set up a pilot study with one of our institutions in the Czech Republic. For more larger pharma, we had a request from UCB, for example, who wanted to develop a translational imaging method for fibrosis research. In this case, we set up a multi-site biology team and were assembled for putting together in vivo models and imaging modalities within Finland and the Netherlands. So again, different types of partnering examples, but there's no job, I suppose, too big or too small. We're able to work in different ways to match the needs of small industry or large industry. Pharma is a bit different because often they may have what they need. So a request from GSK, an example from something that's ongoing presently, is they wanted long-term access to translational imaging capabilities in immunoinflammation R&D. In this case, we were able to set up a hub for GSK, which involves 6 EATRIS institutions. And together, they work to develop new PET ligands, MRI for characterization of inflammation, and optical imaging. So again, a different type of partnering example, but showing the flexibility that EATRIS can provide in these type of collaborations for industry, big and small. So what's in it for industry? Well, it's providing them fast access to high academic expertise, expert advice, that single point of contact to multiple sites. It is a no cure, no pay. So basically, if the industry or SME is not happy with what we bring back to the table, they don't have to work with us and there's no fee. It is always regulatory compliant research, and we always aim to have a translational trajectory. And of course, multi-site R&D projects are facilitated, which I think is the wow factor of EATRIS, because it can go through one site, one stop, and they'll be able to access multiple sites across Europe. So I wanted to just talk about regulatory services and what EATRIS presently provides. Our previous scientific director, and he is still with us leading the regulatory work that we do at EATRIS, Giovanni Miliaccio. He is a former member of the CAT at EMA, so he still helps us on different projects. So what we help academics, either within their funding proposal or SMEs looking for advice, we help them with expert opinion. So we do this in different ways. An SME, we may set them up in a 1-hour meeting with our expert to answer those simple questions. Do I need a GLP tox study? Do I need to do a classification process for my ATMP in Europe if I'm coming from the States? Simple stuff like that. Well, simple maybe to the regulators, but not to the SMEs. So EATRIS supports different groups in that process. That includes orphan drug designation applications, putting together the briefing book for scientific advice of the EMA or a national competent authority. Informal scientific advice, such as Innovation Task Force, which I'm sure you're all aware of. And we also have a regulatory database, which is free of charge to all of you, which basically lists the information across 27 European countries of where you go to find the advice you need, the forms you need, and all the processes from each different national competent authority. So I would suggest that you check that out. So what type of projects does EATRIS do? Well, currently we're involved in projects ranging from preparing a scientific advice for a novel antigen for a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine. We're also working on malaria project for a new type of malaria vaccine. We also in the process of supporting an ODD as well for another group. So we recommend or advise that if you have any of these needs, that you approach us and we can see how we can support you too. Our main job, of course, is to support the 127 institutions as they go after the funding they need as well. And sometimes that requires some regulatory due diligence and input. So finally, I'd like to talk about a new funding call that we were successful in getting, that you can apply for free regulatory services if you're developing a vaccine, a therapeutic, or a diagnostic against SARS-CoV-2. This project is called EATRIS. It started about 4 months ago, and it's called Integrated Services for Infectious Disease Outbreak Research. What does it offer? Well, it offers you, the researcher, free access to resources, services, and expertise. How it works is we release calls. There's one open right now on SARS-CoV-2 and monkeypox. And you go to a catalog and you select the services you need. Basically, this includes everything from analytical services, cell models, everything you could think of, including regulatory advice. So again, how it works, you go to the EATRIS site, which is now live. You select the call that's relevant to you, for example, monkeypox or SARS-CoV-2. And you say, well, I need cell models because I want to look at my legacy compounds to see if I can validate them in an animal model. You choose the animal model, and then that will come to each of the RIs who can provide that service for you. It's a simple 1-page form, and as long as it makes sense, it should pass the review board if it's a solid project, and then that service will be paid for you. This will go on for the next 3 years, so I highly recommend those on the call today that are working in infectious diseases to use this resource. We're talking about 300 services across 14 research infrastructures. So please take a look, and if you want any more information, you can contact Ulrika or myself, and we'll be happy to give that to you. Excuse me. Along the same lines, the same type of funding model, at the start of September, another similar project called Cancer began. Now, this is similar, where we have a catalog of over 300 services from all these research infrastructures, but in this case, for cancer research. So the idea over the next 3 years, we're going to release calls offering services for new therapeutic solutions, disease models, biomarker research, all within cancer research. And the first calls will be released in the next few weeks. So again, very simple process, and I would recommend that you take a look at that in the coming weeks. And again, I think that's it. A very, very fast snapshot of what EATRIS is. I think this infrastructure overview should kind of give you an idea of what we try to do. Of course, at the center of our galaxy, and I suppose yours as well, is the patient. And we try and support that through expertise across the 5 platforms, providing services and activities from regulatory, education, training, communications, specific COVID-19 expertise. I think we have 50 research groups across Europe that are working on COVID-19 specifically. I think we've supported 45 projects to date in COVID-19. And of course, to support you, the users, academia, SMEs, charities and funders, and big pharma. So again, very fast, quick overview, helicopter pitch, but we are always happy to provide you more information about how we work, anything I've just mentioned on those calls. So reach out to Ulrika, to myself. And on that note, I could take any questions if they are there. So thank you.
Thank you very much, David. So are there any questions for David?
I don't have any in the chat.
No?
Okay, so all very shy.
Okay.
I mentioned
yes.
We're available for any questions if you come up with them after.
Yes. So I strongly urge you to think about the EATRIS in this process to get the regulatory consultancy help that you need for your projects. So with this, we will move over to the presentations from RegSmart, and the first in line is Anna Wannberg. So please.
My technical support will help me here. I will share the screen. So, what do you see?
It looks nice.
Good.
Perfect.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting us for this webinar. And my session, I will speak about taking your product to the market, the art of choosing the right regulatory framework. And what is a regulatory framework? That might be the first question to ask yourself. Well, it's based on legislative acts. And in the EU setting, we have EU regulations that has to be applied in its entirety across the EU. And an example of that is the MDR for medical devices. We also have directives that...
Sorry, can I just interrupt? Do you think you could place yourself closer to a microphone?
Yes. Thank you for... So, we have directives that has to be implemented in national legislation, and that is laws, regulations, and ordinances. Another mandatory part is Commission decisions that is binding to whom it is addressed. I have tried to mark the mandatory parts in the regulatory framework as red, whilst the voluntary as grey, although this is sometimes a sliding scale. We also have a common specification within the medical device area, and they are implemented as regulations and thereby binding. For medicinal products and also biocides, you need to have a market authorization before putting your product on the market. Mostly medicinal product has to follow pharmacopoeias. Going to the voluntary parts, we have guidelines, we have recommendation, and we have opinions. We have also standards that can be divided into technical standards, being method-specific or product type-specific. And we also have harmonized standards, by fulfilling a harmonized standard, you fulfill some essential requirements, and that is equal to what in the MDR and the EVDR for the medical device area is now stated as general safety and performance requirements. And you can find out which part of the legislation you fulfill in the harmonized standards by looking at the harmonized standards Annex CETA. Depending on the type of product you have, the regulatory frameworks will differ. And sometimes it's very obvious what kind of regulatory framework you have to follow, but sometimes there are aspects that need to be taken into consideration to know if your certain regulatory framework is applicable or not. As a consumer, it might not always be easy to know the difference between, for example, a medicinal product and a medical device. That can also go on for other types of products. And as a manufacturer or another economic actor, you may have the same experience. So, if you don't see the difference, does it matter then? Yes, of course it does matter. Because we all want safe and effective products. Why? Well, taking an example from my life, I'm a mom and sometimes my children get fever. Then I use my thermometer to know how high the fever is. I don't want them to get an electric shock from the thermometer. So I want it to be safe, but I also want to have an accurate number showing how high the temperature is. That is the effectiveness. And if the fever is high, I might use medicinal products. They have also to be safe and effective. As a manufacturer, another motive may be the money. If you have a product that failed to deliver, you get bad reputation. If your product is dangerous, you might even have to pay indemnities. During the development phase, the earlier you see some problem and correct it, it will cost less than doing it in the end of the development. So early elimination of problems and non-conformities can save big money. You also have to fulfill the requirements to satisfy the authorities, but by doing so, you also create trust for your product. The aim of all legislation is safety, and that is stated, as you can see, in several different legislations taken from the EU market. Of course, the same goes for, if you cross the Atlantic, goes for FDA and the Code of Federal Regulation Title 21 that set up the scene in the US. Another way of putting this safety and effectiveness is by benefit and risk. And risks must be acceptable when weighed against benefit. This is particularly relevant for the medical purpose area, and then we're speaking about medicinal products and medical devices. So, looking at the different types of products, if you go for electric equipment for households, no risk will be allowed. But for a medical device, such as an implantable defibrillator, electric shock is the mode of action. Therefore, risk of inaccurate shock cannot be completely eliminated. So you have to weigh the risk against the benefit, and you have to look what's in it for the patient using it. So, regulatory is a requirement, So make the most of it. When should you use regulatory? Well, from the beginning of a development process and development project. And why should you use it? Well, to identify key risks and opportunities. What makes your product better than others on the market? Who will you have in your team? Well, I would like a multidisciplinary team, someone good in regulatory, someone good in science. If I have a medical purpose, I would like a clinician to be in my team. We are good at different aspects, but all these aspects need to be covered. So how do you start? Well, first of all, you have to know what kind of product you have. Therefore, you're doing a sort of qualification. And you can do that by going through different regulatory framework and see how different products are defined. There might also be guidelines, such as borderline manuals existing for medical devices and cosmetic products, showing how the regulator thinks about different regulatory frameworks and what's most suitable for different type of products. You can also look at similar products on the market to see what kind of regulatory they must fulfill or do fulfill. Definitions exist in the US in the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 21, different for different groups of products. And the same goes for the EU. I will not go through this word by word, but rather point out some aspects. Here in the medical device area, it's described type of different products and what the product should do. It should have a medical purpose. Further, it is said that it should not achieve its principal intended action by pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic means. So we have both inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. If you have a pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic principal intended action, you might be a medicinal product. They are also used for treating or preventing disease and has thereby a medical purpose. And as you might see, they can assert their effect by a pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic action. If we go to cosmetic products, they are used at external parts of the human body and should be used for cleaning, perfuming, changing their appearance, protect them, keeping them in good conditions, or correcting body odors. Food has to be ingested by humans to be a food. And biocidal products are used against harmful organisms and destroy, deter, or rendering harmless for those organisms. And they have also the exclusion criteria that it should be other than mere physical or mechanical action. So we have spoken about the intended purpose. And if it's a medical intended purpose, the principal mode of action matters a lot. But also other aspects you have to calculate and consider. Where in or on the body the product will be used, the intended target population, is it humans? Yes, most often, but is it consumers or is it healthcare and patients? And therefore also the use environment, is it to be used at home or is it used in a hospital? The route of administration matters. If you have a product that's going to be injected, it is likely to be a medicinal product or maybe a medical device. you have to have data to support your claims, scientific data, and for medical purposes, clinical data. You also have to know what market you're aiming for. Is it the EU? Then you have to find the regulatory frameworks within the EU. But if it's the US, you have to look at their regulatory frameworks. I will take an example to make it clearer. If I have a product, let's say I make a cranberry juice for oral use without any claims, I most probably have a food. But if I put my juice into capsule for oral use and claims that it's rich in vitamin C, I might have a food supplement. If I have a medical purpose with my capsule and it follows certain preparations set up by the EU and the Committee for Traditional Herbal Medicinal Product, or Herbal Medicinal Products, actually, they have made a draft EU monograph, so it might be possible to have the product as a medicinal product. If I use the same product and put it on the market as a medical device, then I might experience problems, because then we have a Commission implementing decision showing that it can't be excluded that cranberry exerts its effect by pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic means, and therefore this is not a suitable regulatory framework to use. If I put my cranberry in a body lotion for a smoothing purpose, I might have a cosmetic product. So, where to start? Well, from the very beginning, start with a qualification. What kind of product do you have? Look at different definitions. Then go on to classification, how to apply so-called sub-rules. For medical devices, we have different classification rules. For medicinal products, there might be different ways to go and different types of medicinal products. If you're in a biocidal area, you have different product types. And this will matter in what regulatory requirements that will be applicable for your product. So use a top-down approach. First, what to do, the regulatory requirements, and then go to the next step, how to do it. And then you have to rely on guidelines and standards, for example. So, start with the end in mind when you're starting your project. What will you achieve in the end? What kind of product do you want? What kind of claims do you want to add to it? And then find the relevant regulatory requirements. You can fulfill them by using standards or guidelines. And learn about the market. What is the competitive advantages over currently available therapies? What endpoints are important to your stakeholders? It is a good way to go to improve safety by observing surveillance data from others. And you have to have evidence. If you have a medical claim, then you have to have clinical evidence. Everything you claim needs to be based on evidence, studies by you or others. The things you do needs to be documented, including literature reviews that need to go through appraisal process. If you don't have that documented, it does not exist. So, is the regulatory framework your friend or your foe? That depends if it's applicable for your product, if it's regulatory relevant, if it's scientifically sound. if you, for example, try to have a medicinal product fit into the medical device regulatory framework, it will be like trying to find how to cook lasagna in a cupcake book. Thank you. Any questions? You're welcome to raise them.
Thank you very much. So are there any questions for Anna? This is the opportunity to put questions, but you have also later on an opportunity to meet with regulatory experts, but we'll come back to that possibility later.
So I will leave room for Robert now.
Okay, so please, Robert, give us a crash course.
That will be my pleasure, Pontus. Do you all hear me? Fine, excellent then. So my name is Robert Hägerkvist, and I'm here today to talk to you how to register a new drug product in the EU. That's the main focus today, but I will also briefly discuss the US. And I'm an ex-regulator myself. I worked for 10 years at the Medical Products Agency in Sweden as a clinical assessor mainly. So this is the lessons I've learned from the inside of the regulatory system, I think. So let's start with what is most important to know. Drug development is a team effort. And the drug development team, that is your most valuable asset. On this picture, we have 57 workers constructing a building. Now, you do not need to be that many at start, but you need to understand that drug development is a team effort right from start. An old truth says that development of a new drug takes 10 years and costs $1 million. This does not always have to be true, but I have never heard of anyone doing it all alone. The advice is to start building a strong team early on. Now, your invention or science or data that you have should be turned into a project. And that this project should be managed by this strong team. This is all done in a competitive environment, and you need to be heard and attract interest. So it's time to start communicating your drug product. And one starting point for communication to stakeholders is to compile a target product profile, or a TPP. This document describes the product as it is meant to be once placed on the market. You see, drug development is in a way building a ladder and carefully climbing up step by step. However, you need to know where you are heading to know that you are on the right track. And the TPP helps you to keep that end in mind. And I will just briefly talk you through the three cornerstones of the TPP. And we'll start with the science, or the data that you generate. That's in the bottom right corner here. Importantly, for a new drug product, considering the data at hand, you need to identify the medical need to be able to propose an indication. Which disease do you target? Which patients could benefit from the new drug product? Is it intended for prevention or treatment, or has it a diagnostic purpose? Is it to be used in monotherapy or in combination with another drug or a medical device? That you should characterize in the science part. And the regulatory context, the regulatory cornerstone down here, that is the framework that helps you to understand your data from a need to know, nice to know perspective, I would like to say. And this is a big difference between research and project development. In research, all data could be very important, as it can help to form new hypotheses and bring science forward. But in drug development, some data are required, other data are nice to have, but some data you can do without. If you start using the data and try to identify the unmet medical need, you can then approach the third cornerstone, the commercial aspect. Eventually, someone needs to be willing to pay for your product. And if you can describe the usefulness of the product in a clinical context, you can evaluate the commercial potential of your product. I think that this is generally the best approach for the small company. Start with the science or your data at hand and build from there. Okay, the end result of the TPP is the product label, I would like to say. The TPP is a living document that is changed and altered as new data is being generated. But after approval of the drug that you are developing, the TPP dies and is reborn as the label, as it's termed in the US, or as the summary of product characteristics, or the SMPC, which is the European term for the very same document, I would like to say. So the label, or SMPC, that summarizes all relevant information and states how the drug should be used. The label SPC is also the guide to the prescriber, and the label, or SPC, is also the source for your marketing activities. As stated, drug product development is resource consuming and requires funding. I would like to end this chapter by asking you to remember the team, your key asset. A team with proven experience in drug development is more likely to succeed again. Investors may say that we don't just bet on the horse, we bet on the jockey too. And the ID, your ID or your data for the new drug product as communicated in your TPP, that is the horse. And the team, well, that is your jockey. So choose your jockey carefully, build a strong team. Now, this next part is regarding data requirements. What data is required? What is need to know data in drug product development? Is it different for different drugs? The short answer I would like to say is no. The same high data standard is required for all drugs. But as we will learn, you may not need to generate all that data yourself. First, data can in drug development be broadly divided into three categories. Quality, the physical characteristics of the drug substance and drug product. This is also termed CMC, chemistry and manufacturing control. Data in this area is usually generated by the company itself. And in your team of experts, you will need an expert in this area of development. Non-clinical data, that is usually the starting point for research, with some pharmacological data in vitro or in vivo in an animal model that constitutes the ID on how the new drug should be used, or the mechanism of action. The non-clinical area also covers toxicology to characterize the risks associated with the new drug. Now, toxicology is, in comparison to pharmacology, extensively regulated. This is to ensure that when the new drug product is administered to man, enough is known about the risk so that the safety of the human subjects can be considered acceptable. And in your team, I think you will also need a non-clinical expert, preferably someone with toxicological experience. The third data set is the clinical data. Now, clinical data, that's data from humans. You have pharmacokinetic data to describe what the body do with the drug, how is it distributed, how is it eliminated, and so on. Then you have efficacy and safety data, usually generated in a stepwise fashion. You start with phase 1 in usually healthy volunteers, then in patients during phase 2 to try to do dose finding and proof of concept. And finally, in phase 3, where you generate your pivotal efficacy data that should demonstrate that the drug is effective for its purpose. For the non-clinical and clinical data, you can use different data sources. I will get back to this. First, I would like to say something about those regulators that you have to interact with. And the regulators, they are scientists. They are your expert counterparts. And the regulatory system is in a way a mirror to your team. The regulators, they will assess your data, and they will do this in the regulatory context with guidelines and regulations. And to have a good discussion with the regulators and to understand the regulators, you will need the corresponding expertise in your team. And this is why, at least in part, why the team is so important. I would just like to say this about guidelines. Must guidelines always be followed? And I would like to say no. Guidelines are only guidelines. Guidelines are, to some extent at least, written for a general purpose, with more or less level of detail. And in many instances, the uniqueness of the new product may not fit perfect to the guidance. When you don't adhere to the guidelines, you need to justify this. Because in some cases, you have to deviate from the guidance. But you should ideally have the regulators agree to this deviation. And you should be prepared and have good arguments. I will get back later in the presentation to when you do this with the regulators and what it's called. It's in the advice area. We should also remember that the industry is driving research and regulations forward. And sometimes there are no guidelines. The industry paves way into new areas of research, and the regulators, they have to follow, and then they have to create and develop new guidance. Sometimes you're ahead of the bunch, and then you pave new way. As Anna said, the key concept here is the benefit-risk balance. And this is what you will use your data for, is to evaluate benefit versus risk. This is the key concept. So that is, for the indication sought, is the benefit of using the drug greater than the risks associated with its use? And I think it's important for you to early start thinking in benefit-risk terms, relative terms. What is an acceptable risk in terms of the benefit that you demonstrate? You don't have to be that afraid for risks or adverse reactions if there is a clear benefit. The classic example is in oncology, where you accept the loss of hair very much. If you, on the benefit side, you can expect a prolongation of life, increased survival. So start thinking early relative benefit risk terms. Look at that enthusiasm here. Look at that new data. It's the generation of data that propels the project forward, and the generation of data that will direct your development. Well, remember, in the end, it's your data that will be evaluated by the regulators and other stakeholders. Nothing else. It's your data. Now I'll come back to where I started with talking to you about for a while ago with different sources of data. And we will see now that not all data needs to be new. Regulators will accept that you use data already generated as presented in scientific literature. And for some products, you can also rely on a previously approved drug with the same active substance that's termed a reference product. And you will not need to duplicate that data. So company data or data you generate yourself, that's usually when you're working with innovative, novel active substances. You need to generate data from scratch because it's not been described before. But if you're working with a known active substance, you can use literature data as well. I mean, peer-reviewed publications, meta-analysis, textbooks, etc. And if you're working with an active substance that's already approved, you can rely on a reference product that's been previously approved in the EU. This is just to illustrate the organization of data in drug development. We have the common technical document, the CTD. And this is just the CTD triangle describing the different modules, 1 through 5, where you put all your data to present it to the regulators. And it may not seem much when depicted like this, but before electronic submissions, I've heard that one application could fill up a truck with papers. So this is a lot of documentation that has to be generated. Now I will switch to legal basis and data sources and try to explain how they are connected. So for a drug to be approved, it has to have a legal basis. In EU directive, these legal bases are articles, which describe which data is required for drug product approval according to that article. And I will not bore you and get into more level of detail than this. I just want to let you hear the names and provisions of the common articles in the EU to help you understand how different drug products are approved. On the top left corner, you see the complete dossier based on company data. That's Article 8.3. That is for new innovative medicines. But you can also have a complete dossier that's based on literature data alone. That's Article 10A, or well-established use, where you have specific conditions to fulfill the well-established criteria here. Those are complete dossiers. But you can also generate a dossier based on the reference product. The simplest example perhaps is Article 10.1. Those are the generic drugs, or the Me Too, where you use bioequivalence to bridge to the reference product. And by being bioequivalent, you get to use that product's data. We have also in the dossiers based on reference product, the Article 10.3, or the hybrids, where your product is not a direct copy of the reference drug. It's similar in many aspects, but not all. And an example here could be if you're working with a locally acting generic product. Local acting products cannot be assessed as being equivalent by using systemic plasma concentrations because they're acting locally. And those kind of products will become hybrids or Article 10.3 applications. Then we have also Article 10.4, which is the biosimilars that are generics to biological products. So those are the legal bases in the EU. And in the simplest form, and this is how data and legal base are connected. So Article 8.3, your full application, you have your own company data all the way. But you can also make a full dossier relying only on literature. That's Article 10A, the well-established use. Or you can rely on data that someone else has already generated in the reference product that's already been approved. And then you make a generic drug according to Article 10.1. So this is what I mean by saying that the same high standard of data are applied for all drugs, but you differ the sources of data. The bar is the same, it's the same high bar, but you can use different sources. Now, briefly about the US then. This is just an overview. I won't go into more detail in this, I promise. Just the names in the US. And the US, they have a very similar reasoning as in the EU, but they use a different terminology. So they have the 505B1. That's very similar to Article 8.3 with company data alone. And they have the 505B2, where you mix company data with other approved product data or literature, which in a way is similar to the hybrid application in the EU. You have the 505J, that's the pure generic products. It's a copy of a reference US drug then, not a European drug, obviously. And they have their BLAs, the biologics license applications for biological products. We talked about that regulators are your mirror counterparts and how to interact and discuss with them during drug product development. I think it is important to keep your products aligned with regulatory requirements, because this reduces the risk that later on regulators will not agree that your data is sufficient. So it might be time to ask for an advice. And scientific advice is to have an interaction with the regulators. And what should you discuss in your interactions? Well, these are some examples here. You can discuss with them if you have a new methodology that you would like to have their view on. Perhaps you would like to confirm your clinical program. Will this be adequate? Maybe you would like to discuss that you deviate from guidelines, or that you have new unexpected findings that you have evaluated and you want to discuss with the regulators if they can agree to your conclusions about these findings. In all instances, the applicant's proposal is important. You must have a position of your own. And then the regulators will tell you if they agree or not. But they will not just simply tell you what to do if you don't present the proposal yourself or a position. So it is important to be well prepared for these meetings for them to be most fruitful. So when should you have your advice then? Well, it's common to ask if the next proposed step in drug development is accepted by the regulators. But I would like to recommend you to think of the advice as a continuous dialogue with regulators throughout development. Nevertheless, you should only ask for advice when it is needed, if things are clear-cut and you have no concerns. Advice may just cost time and money without adding any benefit. Now, the US and the EU are different in some respects. There are different regulatory systems. Now, in the US, you have one country and one agency, and that's the FDA. And for many drug companies, US is the most important market, and that is mainly for financial reasons, I would say. And FDA is therefore a key partner for regulatory interactions. In the EU, we have a common EU regulation also, but we have 27 different agencies, and we have EMA, the European Medicines Agency. So if you are to go to scientific advice in the EU, you first have to consider whether you should go to a national advice targeting one of those national competent authorities. Most countries do offer advice, and you can have your choosing of a country where you know that you have good expertise in the area that you would like to discuss. And these are often discussion meetings where you meet face-to-face, and minutes are less formal. It's more of a discussion. And the fees differ from country to country. So that's one option, to go to national advice and then select a country, or perhaps go to two different countries. You can also apply for central advice via EMA. That is an all of EU advice. You get the input from all EU's 27 member states. Here you cannot choose your experts. They will be appointed by the system. You will get formal minutes, and it's mostly a written advice. It's a rather high fee too, but a reduction is possible for small companies. And this is generally a longer process than the national advice. When you interact with the FDA, they have different terminology here. They have the type A, type B, and type C meetings. And the type A meeting, that is when you have a sort of a crisis. It's a meeting needed to help an otherwise stalled product program to proceed. You can have some unexpected severe adverse events in a clinical trial that you can be put on clinical hold, and then the FDA will alert that they would like to have a type A meeting. Then you have the type B meetings. For example, the pre-investigational new drug application meeting or the pre-IND meeting. You have the end of phase 2 meeting. You have a pre-new drug application meeting. Now, type C meetings, they are meetings about everything else. It could be for example, the validation of a surrogate endpoint, which is a rather big question, but that's handled during a type C meeting. So I boxed the type B meetings here just to signal that these are the typical meetings that almost all drug development projects go through when interacting with the FDA. They have these 3 meetings. Now the new word again, a procedure, and a procedure for market authorization. And that is on which EU market should a new drug product be sold. That's decided by the procedure. So we have the national procedure where you apply for approval in a single EU state of your choosing. Or you can go for a decentralized procedure where you involve several EU states. And in this kind of procedure, one member state will act as the reference member state. And that's the member state is the ones who do the assessment. And the other states involved, they are concerned member states. And they make comments to the reference member state's assessment. You have also the option for a center procedure where you seek approval in all of EU at the same time. And the center procedure is mandatory for certain medicines, such as ATMPs, and also for certain diseases such as cancer. I will now round off my presentation with some words about drug products for rare diseases, or the orphans. So, what is an orphan drug designation in the EU? Well, in order to have an orphan drug designation, or an ODD, you have to fulfill certain criteria. And the first is the prevalence criteria. And that is that the disease should not affect more than 5 patients in 10,000 inhabitants in the EU. The US, they have a slightly different number here. They use maximum of 200,000 persons affected by the disease in the US. And the disease should be life-threatening or chronic debilitating. And in the EU, you should also demonstrate significant benefit over current treatment. If you can fulfill this criteria and you have an ODD, you do get some incentives during development, such as reduced fees. And you will also get the market exclusivity in the EU of 10 years if you are approved with orphan status. And I think that the orphan conception is rather popular in drug development. And I think that there could also be some common misunderstandings regarding orphans. So I would like just to highlight that orphan designations, it's not the way to shorten time to approval. You will have the same requirements from the regulators for quality, efficacy, and safety data as for a non-orphan product. And lastly, that the indication must be medically plausible. You cannot salami slice an indication trying to fit it into the maximum 5 patients per 10,000 inhabitants. That will not be accepted. So, lastly then, we work with different companies here at RegSmart, and one of them were kind enough to send us a couple of slides just to demonstrate how it could be to work with RegSmart. And this is the CureTech Bio. They're a small drug development company in Umeå that develop new classes of antibacterial agents that target antimicrobial resistance. And the lead program is focused on healthcare-associated infections and is in hit-to-lead or lead optimization phase. We have performed a high-level regulatory strategy analysis and provided some recommendations of questions, issues to focus on in the future product planning of Curate. And this is what they said. They thought that the regulatory guidance that we provided, it helped them to plan crucial activities early in the project. And we also discussed the opportunity and incentives that were possible for them, and they thought that this was helpful in order to attract investors or collaboration partners. And we also did this more long-term regulatory activities, or long-term, it was until phase 1. And they thought that this was helpful for them to plan for application and budget and various activities. And this is a very typical customer for us. I think we work with small pharma companies, but also academia. So perhaps we'll meet again. That was all from me. Do you have any questions?
Yes. So thank you very much for this crash course. And at the end, we will come back to this opportunity to get some initial help from RegSmart. But let's move on then to the next presentation by Karin Westermark.
Yes, thank you. So I will speak about how to bring your medical device to the market. As you will see, it's rather different from pharmaceuticals. The drugs, they are far ahead of the medical device in many ways. So medical device runs after and doesn't have the same maturity in these processes. But still, of course, it's highly regulated. And one thing I think to steal with pride from the drug development experiences is the target product profile that Robert talked about. So it was initially invented for communication in drug development, but it's very useful also for medical device to ensure that all the important aspects are covered in the development. So some of these important considerations is what's the clinical need of your medical device or your in vitro diagnostic device, which is very similar in the regulations. Is there a current treatment? What's the state of the art? Who are the competitors? What claims do you wish to make for your future product? And will someone be willing to pay for it? Which markets do you aim at introducing the product? And what are the applicable regulations and requirements there? And ideally, just as Robert was talking about, it should be a multidisciplinary team to cover all the aspects here. Scientists, clinicians, and regulatory. And in particular, I think the inputs from clinicians at an early stage is really important, because you really need to understand the clinical aspects and needs when you start developing, so you know the whole picture. Just like Anna said, no one knows everything, and there will be things you never thought about. And if you use this multidisciplinary team, then this will help you to go from your great innovation to a successful product on the market. Oops. Of course, all these cornerstones are very important, but I will speak about the regulatory today. And this is very similar to Anna's presentations. Just think about regulatory requirements not as a bunch of documents you need to generate because someone said so. It's not only formalities, it's a must, so make the most out of them. But it's very helpful to use this framework. It's based on experiences from someone who's been there and got through the process before you. And don't save this until the end of the development process, because then you will have to recreate a lot of things that you already did. You should start thinking early so you have the plan where you're heading and make the right data in each step. And of course, as you said, Pontus, no, it was David, it's for the benefit of the patients. That's what it's all about. That's why regulations are there in the first place. And when you sit on the regulator's side, you have the perspective of the patient. That's what matters. So the regulators care about protecting the patients. So regulations are unfortunately not globally harmonized, but there are organizations who try to harmonize them as much as possible. So the regulations are based on similar concepts. So as you will see, they use different words and different procedures, but the concepts are rather similar. But as you know, we are 27 member states in the European Union. And we have managed to get common regulations, the medical device regulations, MDR, and the in vitro diagnostic regulations, IVDR. And this, if you fulfill the regulations, you have access to the entire European market. So it's not that you only market your product in one country. You're allowed to be on the whole European Union market if you get this medical CE mark. So it's very different from what Robert said, that there will be a mirror at your regulatory authority who has all the competence you have. That's not the way it works, because medical devices are very different. They vary from very simple products to very complex ones, and therefore a different system is used to access the market. And in Europe, we don't have authority approval of devices, but we do have that the authorities conduct market surveillance. In the US, it's different. They have the FDA who regulates, and they can approve devices, and they do the market surveillance. And this is to show you the organization. They have different centers that are responsible for different types of products. And for medical device, it's most often the Center for Devices and Radiological Health that's involved. So regulations may not be globally harmonized, but they all share the same goal: to ensure that medical devices are safe and effective, and that their benefit outweighs the risks. This is the essence of all regulations. And sadly, the regulations were developed in response to harm. That goes for pharmaceuticals, and that goes for medical device. This is one of the examples of what can happen. This was some computer-controlled radiation therapy machine that was introduced to the market in the 80s. It had functions that relied on software, which had not been properly tested, and software control of medical devices was very new in these days, the 1980s. So actually this Therac 25 caused one of the most devastating computer-related incidents to date. There were only 11 systems sold, but these caused 6 severe incidents and 3 deaths. And what they didn't know was that when they placed this on the market, they believed that software could never fail. So they hadn't tested the hardware, this whole machine, together with the software. So one thing that happened was that when they tried to illuminate with an electron beam, they could accidentally use the electron beam that was made to generate X-rays, which means that you get an overdose of 100 times too high dose. And the dose was high already to begin with, because this was to treat cancer, not diagnostics, but to treat. So it was a high dose. The manufacturer did not take good care of these incidents. They told the hospitals that this had never happened anywhere else, although they were aware of incidents and they didn't investigate themselves. And as a consequence, as you see, it took during 3 years this happened. And finally, the FDA and the Canadian authorities, they said that this could not be used anymore. And after this, the regulations were improved. First of all, the incident reporting requirements were increased. So that made it easier for other hospitals to look at what was already being reported. And it was also introduced that software incidents should be reported at all. And there was also the introduction of a completely new ISO standard for medical device software. So, moving forward, how do you get your product to the market? What's the procedure for market authorization when you wish to bring your innovation to the market? Now there comes back some familiar word from Anna. You need to qualify your device. There are so many different products out there. How do you know if it's a medical device? Well, the definition of a medical device varies between markets. So I use the World Health Organization's definition. It's something like an article, instrument, apparatus, machine, software that's used to prevent or diagnose or treat something, or to detect or restore or correct a structure or function of the human body for some health purpose. And typically, the purpose is not achieved by pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic means, since then it would probably be a drug. So first of all, actually, it's not enough just to look at your device and say whether it's a medical device or something else. You have to determine its intended purpose. This is really a cornerstone in medical device development. So the intended purpose is simply a short statement that describes the use of your product. And it's not the technical description. So for example, if you would have a smartwatch that measures heart rate, that's the same technology, but it doesn't have to be a medical device. It depends on what the claims are. If it's intended to measure heart rate for a therapeutic purpose or a diagnostic purpose, then yes, it would be a medical device. But if you don't make any medical claims, but maybe say that you can use it when you optimize your training for a marathon race, then no, it's not a medical device. So the intended purpose is really important, that it determines or may determine if it's a medical device or not. And thereby it determines if you have to follow the medical device regulations or not. Once you know that you have a medical device, then you need to classify it. And this is a way that the regulations try to deal with the large range of medical devices. It could be, a medical device could be this simple spatula of wood that you can use to look in a children's throat, but it can also be the ECMOs that replace heart and lung function of a severely ill patient. And of course, it's difficult to have the same regulations for both. So regulations are built on the same principle, but then there are different types of risk classes that determine how the scrutiny of assessments, simply said. So you divide your products into risk classes. Basically, there are 3 risk classes, going from class 1 with low risk devices that have a low risk of causing death or serious injury, up to the high class 3 devices. And in the European Union, there are subclasses within class 2. So we have 2A and 2B. Examples of very high risk classes are electrodes that are used in the central nerve system, like in the brain or in your spinal cord. But it could also be pacemakers to get your heart beating in the right rhythm. And it doesn't have to be implants. For instance, these defibrillators that you can find everywhere in shopping malls and companies, they are also class 3 devices. And in this tongue depressor on the picture before is a typical class 1 device. So with the higher risks come a higher level of regulatory control, which brings us to the data requirements. What data do you need when you want to place your device on the market? Well, we come back to the risk class. If it's a higher risk class, then you need more stringent data to demonstrate its safety and efficacy. If you go for the EU market, most class 1 devices will be placed on the market based on a self-assessment done by the manufacturer themselves. So there's no approval here. And no one else but the manufacturer will assess the data. And then the manufacturer registers the product in the database of the competent authorities. And it doesn't mean that you don't have to have all the documents in place. You still have to have all the documentation, but you don't show it to someone at this stage. But you might be inspected by the authors, regulators. And then if you're audited, then you need to be able to show it. But this is unless you have a class 1 product that is sterile, or it has a measuring function, or it's a reusable surgical instrument. In that case, something called a notified body must be involved. And a notified body is the way that the European system deals with a great span of different medical device types. You can't have a competent authority who knows everything about every type of product. So instead, you have notified bodies that are designated by the competent authorities, and they do the assessment on specific things like sterilization methods, or they have the technical experts for all of this. And for these types of, like if it's a sterile class 1 product, then sterility demand must be checked by a notified body. But if you have a class 2 or a class 3 device, a notified body must review the documentation, and they will issue a certificate before the product can be placed on the EU market. For class 3 devices, clinical investigations are mandatory in the EU. And Robert was talking about the dossier. That's not the word that you use in medical device. You talk about the technical file. That's where you collect all the data about your product. And its content is described in the regulations. You look at the Annex 2, and there it's all there. And its content includes a lot of things, but one of the most important is demonstration of conformity with the general safety and performance requirements that are listed in the Annex 1 of the regulations. And the notified bodies, they are very busy at the moment, so it takes a long time to be reviewed by them. And they complain about that they don't get all the information they require to be able to assess products. And one of the things that's missing is the fulfillment of this general safety and performance requirements, because it may seem stupid sometimes. You may have to write that sterility is okay. Sterility is not a concern not applicable because my product is software. That seems so stupid, but you still have to write it because that's a grayscale. You can't assume that the regulator or the notified body will know everything about your product. You have to show that you take responsibility for your product. That's what they want to see, that you have the data and that you understand your product and its requirements. If you instead go to the US market, it's actually not that different in many ways. Most Class 1 devices are what they call exempt from pre-market notification. That means that you just register them in the FDA's database, which is similar to what you do in the EU. Most Class 2 devices you have to send to the FDA using a pre-market notification process, 510K. Most Class 3 devices require pre-market approval, and that means that the FDA has to approve the device before it can be placed on the market. And the big difference between Class 2 and Class 3 is that for Class 2, the manufacturer may often rely on existing clinical data, but Class 3 means they must generate clinical data. And this is a huge difference between the US and Europe. Because if you compare the sources of data that Robert had for pharmaceuticals, then it's your company data, it's data found in the literature, and you're supposed to do a literature searches so you know what has already been done. But then the question is, can you use reference product data? In the US, you can place your device on the market based on what someone else has done if you can show that there is a predicate device that has a similar safety and efficacy as your device. But in Europe, this is not possible. You have to have all the information, the whole technical file for the device. So in practice, you can never use other data on similar devices to prove the safety and efficacy or performance of your own device. But you are supposed to compare to similar devices to prove that you follow the state of the art. So these are some useful links if you want to read more or get more specifics. Now I want to just give some final words on this. Again, this is the most important take-home message, this benefit and risk assessment, and that safety, absolute safety of a medical device cannot be guaranteed. It's not black or white, but it's a risk management issue. And all risks should be minimized. But the risks are very closely related to the benefit of the product. So some risks cannot be limited without losing benefit. But the most important is then that the product's benefit outweighs its risk for the patient or the user. This is to give you an example of what happened this summer. This is a ventilator for respiratory support. So for people who have difficulties breathing, you can use this 24 hours per day to help your breathing. So it's for both hospitals and home use. And of course, such a device will have some inherent risks. For example, it will contain oxygen. So there's a risk of fire or explosion due to leakage. And such a risk must be minimized. But you can never completely remove the oxygen because then you would have no benefit from the product. So it's acceptable, the benefit outweighs the risk. But this specific device was found to cause serious or life-threatening injuries due to inhalation of particles or gases from foam used for sound abatement. So to make it more quiet, they use some kind of foam. And it's been discovered that this foam cannot stand damp or humid environments that are warm, typically like 37 degrees as air that you breathe. So This is, of course, an unacceptable risk. It has no connection to a clinical benefit, and it should have been limited by the use of safe materials in the design. And now they have a huge and a very costly recall, and of course, also the brand and everything loses credibility. So it's really important to go through, if you do a proper design and use your regulatory as your help, then you can avoid this. So this is my last slide. Use regulatory as a map from idea to market to find your optimal route from innovation to the market, and benefit from others' experiences. Know what to do and when, and avoid pitfalls, as that dead fish pond there, and then successfully place your product on the market. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Karin. And do we have any final words from RegSmart before I take my final words?
Yes, thank you for letting us meet. And I think it's an exciting organization, EATRIS.
Yes, and this example that you showed about Q-Tech Bio in Umeå, I think was very interesting. So to summarize, of course, EATRIS Sweden, we are very grateful for having the opportunity to organize this webinar, and we are particularly grateful for the support from EATRIS Plus, which is a support from the European Union to the Swedish node, and which allows us to give this option for this kind of webinars. That's, I think, all from us. So thank you very much again, and good luck with your regulatory questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.